You're listening to Drop It Like It's Pop.
Drop it like it's pop. I'm Georgie Statius.
And I'm Vicken Karkukli. This is where two lovers of pop culture come together, unfiltered and unedited, to analyze the biggest stories, moments, and yes, controversies the world of pop has to offer from our very special point of view as media professionals and international event experts.
I'm the PR specialist.
And I'm the journalist.
Join us as we agree to disagree and talk pop till we drop. We're recording.
We are recording, which is good because we want people to hear it.
It's good. We sometimes have false starts.
It's fine. We make up for it with wit and very good insights into the world.
Our audience, our listeners will be the judge of that.
Well, you know what? If you don't manifest it, it won't happen.
Exactly. Vicken Karkukli, where do we find you today?
Well, look, I'm back in the good old Michelin capital of the world, which is Clermont-Ferrand, France.
I did not know that was the Michelin capital of the world until I met you, until you moved there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I believe it is one of the most recognizable brands in the world. I mean, the Michelin Man, I really have seen in the most remote places that I've been to, not that they're the most remote in the world, but in, rural New Zealand and in the middle of the desert in the United Arab Emirates. So yes, that guy has been around.
That guy has been around.
Mm-hmm. And where are you?
Well, I'm back in Melbourne.
Mm-hmm.
So nothing exciting to say.
Well, I mean, is it getting colder?
Yes, in 2 weeks we will be at our longest night of the year, and possibly the coldest night, and then we will start back heading towards summer. So late June is the
little known fact, though. I think a lot of people don't know that in Australia, I feel you switch seasons on the first of the month. Not on the solstice. I think winter starts on the 1st of June. Am I correct?
Yes. Does not every other country do that?
No, because summer in France will start on the 20th of June, which is the summer solstice.
Which is our winter solstice, yes.
That's right. So interestingly, and I did some research back in the day when I was obsessed with all things Australian, which I still am, but more reasonably, I have to say today. And I did some research to figure out why it was the case that it was on the 1st of the month and not the solstice. I may have found an answer, but I don't have it for you now. So I don't even know. I shouldn't have started that sentence is what I'm trying to say.
Talk about start the episode with a cliffhanger.
Letting people down, that's my specialty.
This episode, we'll get into about last time in case you have any, but we touched on some media interviews. Well, we've touched on media interviews in the last few episodes. Well,
yes.
Every episode we've made a little comment about media interviewing, and we've been promising this episode that we would do one where we do dive into journalism, media interviews, responsibilities, good journalism, bad journalism, maybe bullying. So I'm looking forward to this because...
Bad timing, also a very good one.
Bad timing, yes, yes. And good interviewees. And I've got an example of one that I mean, it's from the 80s, and every time I see it, I just love it.
Well, let's hope there's more than one, though, because
this is of a way an interviewee really turned it back on the interviewer.
Oh, I'm going to like that.
Yeah. But before we jump in, about last time, did you miss anything in our French-Australian conversation?
Yeah, I feel like every time I get enthusiastic about something, I'm going to forget about something else. So I would like to reference what I should have started with, really, which is one of the most important shows about Australia that we had in France. That really wasn't an Australian show because it was a Japanese anime, which in France was called Georgie. So you can understand you can understand all the additional layers of meaning that has taken on over the years for me.
You only
And
like me for my name.
well, you know what? I had completely forgotten about that cartoon probably around the time I met you because it was something that we watched in France probably in the late 80s or early 90s. So the actual title of the Japanese anime is Lady Georgie, and it is the story of a young girl named Georgie who lives in rural Australia. Uh, I believe probably at the end of the 19th century or at the turn of the century, maybe. And she has two brothers, Abel and Arthur. That was their name. You never know a Japanese anime whether the names are kept when they're dubbed into a different
Yes,
language.
yes.
But in France, that's what they were called. So Georgie had a pet koala, so that was really very Australian because you
Because
had a
we
pet
all
koala yourself, didn't you?
absolutely. I mean, we all had pet koalas. It was the 80s.
So she had a pet koala, and it was this whole story of, I mean, I'm not giving it away, but she was wearing a bracelet, and that bracelet has a particular meaning about her, where she really came from. And she had a very troubled relationship with her mother. And then a whole heap of things happened. But that Lady Georgie cartoon was one of the staples of kids' television when I was growing up. So we would watch that cartoon and follow the adventures. I mean, they could get really dark, those Japanese animes,
Mm.
you know. So we would watch it, and then she grew up and then moved to London, which back in the day would take several weeks on a boat, let's be honest.
Look,
So,
yeah.
so long story short, I hope you still have it. I gave you the 7-inch vinyl single of the theme song of Georgie in France. And it's so funny because the picture, the drawing, there's the likeness because you used to have blonde curly hair. And
I
that's,
did. Yes.
I love that picture because it felt so you when I found it at a thrift shop for 50 cents.
Do you know what? It's oh, well, I loved the picture, and I can honestly say I had never heard of it. It never made it to Australia, but maybe because. Do you think it's because you were used to getting shows in France that were dubbed? We didn't. Like I think the only show we really got here, and I'm not going to talk about SBS, but in mainstream was Monkey Magic. Was it Monkey Magic? The
Doesn't ring a
Japanese show.
bell.
I think it was Japanese. So it never made it big here. Had never heard about it. But what does surprise me is that her name was Georgie because growing up, whenever you'd go into, a store
Georgie,
where
we
they'd
need to
have like,
stop. Someone's knocking on the door. I don't know
oh,
what's going on.
oh, we're just going to take a slight pause.
Sorry.
Let's see if I can pause this. Hang on. Well, that was a very exciting pause where apparently apparently our podcast chatter was just too much for the guests in the hotel room next to you. So
Yes. And so here I am casually doing the podcast from the hotel gym. Well, at least you have a smiley face to enjoy while we have a
look,
conversation.
it just shows how versatile you are. I mean,
As if my smiley face wasn't enough.
nothing can stop this podcast. You hopped in a lift, you are now sitting on a treadmill. And I mean, I think that's just the way we roll with it. I think you've got some are they sort of sanitizer wipes to wipe down the
Yes.
machinery there?
Which is a great thing to have in a gym, I have
It's
to
a
say.
great thing. It's a great thing. Well, I'm trying to think where were we before we
Well,
got so
Georgie, and
Georgie.
the dubbed programs that you had, the very few dubbed programs that you had in
Yes, yes.
Australia.
Well, we didn't really have many. I think we had about one. But what interested me more about your little cartoon from Japan is that she was called Georgie because whenever you would go into a store, even now when I go into a store, and they might have like pens with names on or key rings with names on or little, toy number plates with names on or mugs, you would never find a Georgina and you would never find a Georgie well, not that I was Gina or a Gina. It would often go sort of Fiona, Gail, and then it would jump to Helen. So, I mean, I've just grown. It would. I will say. I don't know why I started yelling then. It would depend if they were American items or if they were English. If they were
Yes.
English, there was more chance I would find a Georgie. No, maybe a Georgie, never a Georgina. So that surprised me actually that she was called Georgie.
Well, I mean, it was a happy coincidence for me when I met you. So, but I feel I understand what you went through with the name because being named Vicken, any item that I got that had a name on it was the closest name available. So I have a whole heap of items with randomly chosen names that somehow sounded like mine.
Yes.
Hmm.
We could do it. I mean, I have shared things on Instagram before of, never been able to find your name. I think there's quite a support network for people who don't have common names. I mean, I don't think Georgie or Georgina is an uncommon name, but when it came to those, particularly as I said, if the items came from America, but there is a whole support network of people who could never find their names on things.
Well, there's a very good company based in Brittany here in France where you can actually buy bowls that are very typical of Brittany, bowls for food and soup and cereal, and you can have your name written on them. So you actually give them your name and they will paint it on a bowl,
Yes.
which I mean, kind of makes up for all those years of not finding an item with your name on it.
Exactly. I mean, fun fact. Just thinking of names. So my surname is Statius. My mum's maiden name is Ross, and if I was a boy, Mum they said they did like the name Andrew, so it would have been Andrew Ross Statius, but my initials would have been Arse. And they didn't think that would look good. I mean, that in the 80s, people had monogrammed, briefcases and hankies and things.
Yes.
And they didn't think those initials would come up well in a business.
So now you're GFS.
GFS, yes.
And I did send you a pouch with your initials on it, didn't I?
I still use that, yes.
I love that. I love your middle name, I have to say.
Thank you. Well, that was always my connection to France, birds,
Yeah.
French flower. Anyway. I was trying to think, I mean, look, there's so much I probably did miss out of the last episode. And I did feel I kind of whizzed through it a lot. But I think it's one of those things as you kind of go on, you go, oh, that's right, I could have talked about that and that. But it has sort of reminded me to listen to some music that I haven't listened to. And just by absolute chance, a friend of ours who often texts us random things, I can honestly say I have never spoken to him about this musician, although we do talk about music, but just via text, sent me when did we do the podcast? Friday. He sent me on Monday an Instagram of Plastic Bertrand performing.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, he hadn't listened to the podcast, so we just put it out to the universe.
Look, I think it's great because, I mean, how exhaustive can we get anyway? If you think about the very many ways in which each other's culture has kind of seeped into the other country, So I find it very interesting that some things are coming back to us. And I certainly had a few along the way this last week of, random songs. And we had one-hit wonders from Australia that we never heard from again. And there was this bit of frustration when you really enjoyed something and these were Australian actors and you never saw them ever again on screen because nothing was ever aired again that featured them.
Yes.
So I like that there's kind of, hidden gems here and there that we kind of forget about. And then at one point we remember them. So no biggie. I feel like I should have made more of a point about Round the Twist, though. Because
you should have too.
I absolutely, because I mean, the show was, the episode was long and it was towards the end of the episode. But when you told me when we were in Aries Inlet that was the lighthouse that was on Round the Twist, it was a very interesting moment for me because the way in which I saw Aries Inlet through your eyes and, we drove down and I kind of connected Aries Inlet to the world as I knew it, Whereas
Yeah.
back in the day, Round the Twist was very disconnected from anything I knew. So,
Yeah.
and because the atmosphere of that show, there was almost like a bit of a science fiction element to it,
Mm.
a kind of mystical element to
Oh, it
it.
was
So
very neat. Yeah.
it was very disconnected from anything we knew. And whenever something worked, they tried to push more of the same kind of stuff. So we must have had an Australian show that worked and they thought, okay, we're going to push Round the Twist now. But that was a very specific show to kind of, you got to know what audience you're targeting when you're airing that show. Was it ever big? I don't even know if it was ever big in Australia. Or...
Yeah, no, it was. As I said, I
Hmm.
reckon I was just 1 or 2 years too old
Hmm.
for it when it came out. And you know, when
Yes,
you're
you
a
did say
child, a
that.
year can make quite a bit of
Yeah.
a difference.
Oh, absolutely.
No, it was big here. And of course, it had, I think it was Mark Mitchell who had been on a comedy sketch show here called what's it called, the Comedy Company.
Hmm.
So I'll fact check myself as we do this episode. So yes, no, it was big. Yeah.
Hmm. Okay, well, I remember it, so I'm glad that, other people do as well.
Yes.
So yes, so that was my Round the Twist tribute, and I think that's about it for me. I had a quiz of, I wanted to ask you about a list of artists and whether they'd performed in French or not, like
Yes.
international famous artists, but I think we're going to save the quiz for another
I
episode.
think we'll save it for the last episode of the season, maybe.
The season finale,
The other
yes.
thing, before we move on to this time, the only other thing I was going to say about last time is, obviously we were introduced to France through school and things like that. But we also, it's sort of the pilgrimage of a lot of Australians, well, particularly, well, I mean, I'm talking, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s now. But people probably go to Asia and Central America and South America a bit more. But you would go and work in London stint. And
Yes.
part of that was you would backpack through Europe. So
Hmm.
France was also on a lot of people's travels in their early 20s because that's
Hmm.
what you did. Well, that's what a lot of people did. You went backpacking around Europe. So that I was thinking about that also informed. We always knew someone who was backpacking or traveling and because it costs, back in the day, it still does, but you would go for a long time because for that flight, you weren't going to go for just a week sort of thing. So that kind of was always in our psyche too, that was just on the Europe trip that you would travel to France
Right.
if you were backpacking around. So I think that also had an impact as well in our knowledge of France, and it wasn't a far-flung place like Australia was kind of viewed to the rest of the world, and
Oh,
still
it
is viewed
definitely,
by the rest of the
for
world.
us, it definitely was far
Yes.
because if you were
Yeah.
going to Australia, you were going to Australia.
Yes.
And you had to have a reason to go to Australia
Yes.
back in the day. I
Yeah.
mean, tourism, there's so many amazing places you can go to that are closer, not taking anything away from Australia, but yes, so absolutely. I mean, the few people I knew who visited in Australia from the time I could remember, maybe the 90s, were people friends of my parents who had family in Australia, who had emigrated from Lebanon or, from the Middle East back in the day, until I went. And when I went to UTS in Sydney, I believe I said that in a previous episode, I was the first ever student that my university sent
Yes.
to Australia. So, I mean, talk about, I'm not going to say groundbreaking because that would be incredibly
Trailblazer.
pretentious. No, but I mean, it
It
felt like a
wasn't as common
big
then.
deal. No, it wasn't as common then.
Yes.
Definitely not.
And I remember when you were out here for the Commonwealth Games and you on the Gold Coast, and you were in Sydney, and you said you were hearing so many French accents and French speaking people on the street that
Yes.
20 years earlier was completely not the case.
Oh no, the first year I spent in Sydney was just a handful of times that I heard someone randomly speaking French somewhere outside of university. I had a couple of French friends at university who were from different universities in France, but we all had this passion in common for Australia, and we had that passion in common for traveling to remote places,
Yes.
going far away. Especially a friend of mine who was from Brittany, who had, traveled the world with her family, and she came from a mixed background as well. And these are features that I've seen a lot working, and you know this as well as I do, working in the international events community. We all have this longing for travel to
Yes.
remote places and discovering new countries. So every opportunity you get, you seize, and there's a big sense of gratitude for being able to travel thanks to
Mm,
work, basically.
mm.
Hmm.
Excellent. Well, that was about last time. So
Yes.
now we move into this time.
Yes, let's move into this time. Yes, you did mention that we have spoken a lot about interviews in passing, mentioning interviews here and there and interview styles and different setups for interviews because
Mm.
interviews are conducted in so very many different ways nowadays. So I think talking about interviews as the core topic of an episode had to happen at some point, particularly as I believe the format of the interview is really changing because people are finding so many different avenues now to tell their stories and tell their versions of a story. And it also feels like for a lot of people, there seems to be more caution when it comes to the exercise of the interview. And there seems to be more caution when it comes to doing, a full-on sit-down conversation with an interviewer. And I also believe that in the past few years, the profile of the interviewer as an entity has kind of changed and it
Mm.
has lost a little bit of its shine. I don't know how you feel about it, but I'm happy to go into this and kind of dissect the different kinds of interviews and the different setups for interviews as well.
Yes. No, you're right. And I was, one that sticks in my mind is Prince Harry when
Hmm.
he was on the publicity tour for his book Spare,
Yes,
which um, so he did three interviews because he did go on Stephen Colbert, but his main interviews were with Anderson Cooper and Tom Bradby in the UK, who has a long association with Prince Harry and Prince William, I'm pretty sure. And Anderson Cooper, from CNN in America, who prides himself on, very, what would you say? Reputable's the wrong word, but a lot of integrity. Anderson Cooper, and he's kind of the shining light of good journalism. And I remember
yes,
when these interviews were announced that these were the interviews he was doing. And, we had already known from the Oprah interview with Prince Harry and Meghan that they were prone to making some wild claims that would then be disputed after. And of
right.
course, the Oprah interview was a excellent exercise in watching an interviewee not challenge an interviewer not challenge the interviewee on things that they were saying. So I remember when it was announced about Anderson Cooper and Tom Bradby that obviously Prince Harry had gone to those two, and would have been so much work by his PR team and the publishing house to pick these people that would have been sympathetic to him and that they weren't going to challenge him on these, maybe some points and some factual things in his book that could be disputed. But the commentary was around the risk to the reputation of these interviewers.
Yes,
So, because basically Anderson Cooper was going to be doing a puff piece and not
yes,
calling him out in the way he would have called out someone else on Anderson Cooper Live or any of his other interviewees. So I found that really interesting because suddenly the spotlight went on the people doing the interview, and I think they put themselves in an awkward position because no doubt there would have been deals around what they couldn't say, but what the risk to their, so from Prince Harry's point of view, he's won because he's got these very highly respected journalists doing the interviews, knowing they're not going to challenge him, but the risk actually then fell on the journalists.
hmm. And I think you raise a very good point when saying that just by getting the interview, he's won, because sometimes it's not so much about what is being said, it's the sole fact of being able to be on television. And I think there's something to be said about tell-all books that are also a stepping stone to wider exposure thanks to television interviews. And I feel that that's happened in France on a number of occasions where people kind of came out. And those books, I mean, I'm not talking about Spare, because Spare probably sold quite a few 100,000 copies. But a lot of those times, those books have no other end than being that stepping stone for a wider exposure. It doesn't really matter how many copies they end up selling. People just want to do the rounds and kind of go from one TV set to the next to be interviewed about the book, all the while knowing that that book may not go anywhere anyway in terms of sales or literary exposure. But I think it's the name of the game. And I think that's been, one of the elements of promotion is instrumentalizing one element to kind of get on another.
Absolutely.
So no, you go. Okay. No, I think, and I think that's part of the movement that has happened in the past few years of the interview format changing. I think it's also one of the elements that is representative of how people coming out to tell their version of a story is played out by using all these different formats in very specific ways.
Yes. And sort of extending on from that about telling your story. And I remember when this happened, I said to you, I'd love to know from your point of view. So if you put your journalism hat on, I put my PR hat on. When Baby Reindeer, the Netflix show, hit, and the internet's, the sleuths worked out who Martha, the character, was based on. And then Piers Morgan interviews Fiona Harvey, who's the supposed inspiration for Martha, on his YouTube channel. And I was really interested because my immediate response to that from a PR point of view, and I guess I come from a PR point of view of very much a duty of care of our clients. So, we do research. We don't put our clients in situations where they're going to be grilled or, you do research to see what previous interviews, what content these kind of publications have had. So my immediate response was, oh my God, what's she doing going on Piers Morgan? Because it seemed that, I just don't know how well she had been briefed or media trained, or who was guiding her and looking after her. And I was interested to hear your point of view, because as a journalist, you have been, this is the story to get, this is the guest we need to get, this is sort of the hottest story in town?
Yes, very clearly, because if you're not going to do it, someone else will.
Yes.
And it's very much a matter of knowing what story is hot and running with it. And we've spoken about this on the podcast before, of dissociating one journalist's work from the phenomenon that is the media, or the media frenzy, rather. So when there's a media frenzy, and if you're a journalist, it's very hard to swim against the tide. And I feel like I've used these words verbatim in a previous episodes. But what I mean by saying it's hard to swim against the tide is that newsroom are going to give into that media frenzy. The audience is going to give into that media frenzy. So it's really a case of act now, think later. And I think the duty of care of a journalist who feels that they have an ethical responsibility in that context, because you spoke about the duty of care of the PR specialist advising the potential interviewee, the duty of care of the journalist is to come from a place of kindness and come from a place of ethics and professionalism. That's all you can really do. But then again, if you look at these kinds of interviews and the millions of views that they gather on the platforms, there seems to be a genuine interest. And for sure, we've tried to make sense of some things on this podcast, media phenomenon that we have questioned, and some media dynamics that we have questioned as well. The proof is in the pudding sometimes that it gathers huge crowds. Huge crowds gather to watch these things that we sometimes deem superficial or unnecessary or far-fetched. So in a context where you're a journalist and you're on, on the line to get an interview, get a scoop, I feel like, yes, you're going to do it. And I've certainly on a lower, more reasonable scale, I've certainly given in occasionally along the way to either what I felt was a story worth covering and to the dynamic of act now, think later, because
Yes.
you have a competition, there's some kind of urgency, and you want to get the right story. And I've worked for dailies, and we had weeklies against us as the frontal competition. So we had to kind of figure out which story to publish on which day to be full frontal competition and win that competition with the weekly. And reversely, I've worked with weeklies competing with a daily. How do you deal with a scoop? Just, sitting on a story for a week and hoping it won't break, on the other side. So absolutely. But I think that people need to understand that we have to really differentiate the media frenzy from the work of the international of the individual journalist and the newsroom. But
yes.
go ahead.
Oh no, I was
Sorry.
just going to say that's such an interesting point. And I must say, listening back to the podcast, I do realize I say the word interesting a lot. I need to find a new word. Have you got someone coming into the gym to work out?
To get their bike.
This episode, I don't know where you're going to end. By the end of this episode, you could be out on the street. But it is right, because often there's, you might have a publication like a CNN or a Fox News or,
yes.
Sky News, but you have one journalist or one presenter on there that doesn't actually fit the mold of that tone. And, Fox News has a very clear agenda. I think you could probably say the same about CNN, has a very clear agenda. So that's always interesting when you have a network that is pushing one agenda, but you have one person that just doesn't fit that. And then how that, I guess, juxtaposition of them actually work in that setting.
And sometimes you're the individual journalist and you go against a news and you don't have the same vision of what constitutes balanced news as your newsroom or your editor. And I've been in a situation when I had to cover when what we call marriage for all in France happened. So same-sex marriage, basically. Yep. But we call it marriage for all in France. So when that was passed 10 years ago now, I covered it as a journalist for the paper that I was working for at the time. And I had to ask a certain number of mayors if they would perform those marriages for all. Yes. And I made it a point because, we were not a politically identified publication. Yes. I made it a point to go and find balanced views and do a 50-50 piece.
Yep.
Keep my opinions to myself and just do a 50-50 piece and go to mayors that, yes, were happy about it and would gladly perform those marriages. And some that wouldn't, or some that would delegate to their deputies or find other ways around it. And it was absolutely fine. These were people that I was dealing with on a daily basis. We knew what their opinions and political leanings were. So, it was absolutely fine. I went and did a very, very, a full-page story with very balanced content, but I didn't know what the next page was going to be.
Yes.
And the next page was a half-page interview of an opponent to Marriage for All. I had no control whatsoever over what was going to go on that page. So sometimes you're the individual journalist trying to come up with a balanced interview or with vox pops or tell all stories, but you don't have control over the entire feature.
Yes. And are there, like in that situation, I'm sure you don't take lightly the influence you have as a journalist on a top, people's thoughts or opinions or what their decision's going to be, because, some people really do go to the news to form their opinion. So how do you do that as a journalist when, you have an opinion about something and your balanced writing may actually go against you? Do you know what I mean? Like, as in, I'd be wanting to convince people to vote the way I want them to.
Yes, I see what you mean. Well, I mean, we're taught in journalism school basically what our point of view is supposed to be. And some people choose to go and work for publications that have,
Yes.
clear, defined political editorial lines, and that's absolutely fine. For me, it was more about these opinions exist, and these are also things that the people from those areas need to know. You need to know whether your mayor is going to
Mm,
perform, same-sex marriages or not.
yes.
Uh, so I think there's different levels of information that you're providing to the people. There's the very immediate one of will my mayor do it or not do it? And
Yep.
then there's the overall kind of political story of how a story like that can divide an entire territory. And
Yes.
I mean, from the political leanings of each mayor, you kind of already knew, picking up the phone and calling this or that mayor, what their answer was going to be.
Yes. Are
So
there
there is always no, but I feel the most important responsibility is to come from a place of information.
Yes. Are there any stories you regret? And the reason I ask that is I sometimes hear journalists, particularly sort of news journalists, that, knocked on the door of the grieving family of someone who was killed in a car accident or something, to get the story or to get the quote. And they say after, we really regretted doing that. Are there any stories you regret or you look back and go, gee, I might have approached that differently? Or do you run the story and then you move on and you don't sort of look back?
There's one that I actually didn't want to write and I didn't want to work on. And I had an argument with my editor. And I was like, I don't want to run this story. You're making something out of nothing. And it was about, I believe, a teacher accidentally slapping a student. And then when I spoke to the different parties, it was just literally a guy turning with his face up and then his face landing on someone's face.
Yep.
So there was, as far as I was concerned in terms of
His hand or
journalism,
his face?
and no, so he
Yes.
turned around and his hand landed
Yep.
on a student's face.
Yes.
It was just a movement gone wrong.
Yes.
So
Yes.
it absolutely, to me, was a non-story.
Yep.
But then the idea was that people were already talking about it around town, and my editor, who was a very gifted kind of anything specialist in those kinds of stories, like knew what the freedom of the press was, what we were allowed to write, what we weren't allowed to write. So all of those elements, they were a specialist in. We could run the story, and I had an argument going, but there's nothing here to write about. It's just nothing. So we had an argument, and I was like, I'll write the story, but I don't want to sign it. I don't want my name to be associated with this story. And she was like, it's fine. It's fine. So I don't remember whether my name was on the story or not. I don't remember. But you were talking about the grieving family. I have had to do that. I have had to call the child of a person, and I've written many more stories than that. I have had to call the child, and I came from a place of everyone around town is already talking about it.
Yes.
We just want to set the record straight in terms of given information that is going to be accurate because people are already kind of making up stories in their heads. So that's the point of view that I had for that particular story. But I've also broken stories that were, I mean, I remember one that I was talking about with a friend the other day of I called the head of the union of a company to inquire about what was going to happen now that they were all getting laid off.
Yes.
And they didn't know that they were getting laid off. So
I can look. That just brings something to mind, not about being laid off, but I've been in a situation where we have found out from the media about our own circumstance we were
Yes.
working in.
Mm-hmm.
So when I was working at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, was supposed to be in the October of 2001. September 11 happened. There was uncertainty whether this political meeting would go ahead. So it's all the heads of government of Commonwealth countries. And I remember we had a journalist who was organised to come down and speak to our media centre volunteers, sort of, what it's like being a journo, and maybe give them a bit of context about how the
Mm-hmm.
media behave and why they behave that way, sort of thing. And my friend rang them and said, "I just want to check you're still on for tomorrow." And the journalist said, "Well, you won't need me." And my friend said, "What do you mean?" She said, "It's been cancelled." And so it had gone out on the wires, the news wires from London, and
Yeah.
they hadn't actually told the workforce who were working on the event. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that was what we did. Our contracts ended, but a bit different to being laid off. But it is, when you said that, that situation where you do find out stuff from the media.
Yes. And then very, because what people don't know is those stories, when they break, newsrooms call the police stations every day. Like they have a certain number of, a list of certain numbers that they have to call every day to inquire about the ongoings of the day, what happened, if there were any accidents, if there were any, criminality, and all
Yes,
those. So sometimes you'll have stories come from different channels, but it's
yes,
also a responsibility of a newsroom to reach out to the police stations and the tribunals and the courtrooms to find out what is happening on the daily. And then, of course, you have your individual contacts who will reach out when something happens, and you have local correspondents. So all of those people brought together kind of keep you up to date with what is going on. But for that specific case, that information had already gone public. So it didn't feel at all to me like
yes.
I was going to break the news to anyone. And I was calling them to see, well, how are you seeing the future now that this is happening? But they had kept the information from the employees themselves. So that
It's
was an interesting conversation. Well, I mean, terrifying conversation
Of
to have.
course. And so my PR brain and sort of comms brain goes to, gee, internally that organisation really effed things up. That
Yes.
they weren't, they didn't have a communications plan to their key stakeholders.
Mm-hmm.
And it might have been that they had to tell the staff at the exact same time they told the media.
Mm-hmm.
That's not uncommon, but it's it's interesting, isn't it? And like when you were talking, I was thinking, I was wondering, in the newsroom, is it around, we've got to get the story? I mean, I guess these 2 points actually tie into each other, but, we've got to get the story, or it's about circulation figures, or, how much pressure or how visible is that need for getting those stories to get the circulation figures up, or the readership up, because obviously it ties into advertising. You need good ratings, good circulation figures to attract advertisers to pay the money to fund the media publications. Do you feel that in the newsroom, or it's just about getting the story?
No, you don't really feel that in the
No.
newsroom. From my own experience, you don't
Yes.
really feel that. You get numbers occasionally when they're published. For example, in France, it's very codified. The
Yeah.
circulation numbers will come out at certain times during the year. So you'll find out, and there'll be news stories about the circulation numbers of which dailies are, the most read dailies in the country, and what
Yes.
weeklies. And so it's very codified, the ways in which those figures come out from, I can speak
Mm.
about France because I've only been a journalist in France,
Mm.
but I feel that it's a good thing that you don't feel that kind of pressure,
Yes.
because
Oh, absolutely.
it's a lot to take on as a journalist or a copywriter, to actually feel that pressure on your shoulder.
Mm.
Editors of, I mean, I used to work for newspapers that had we call them different editions depending on the
Yes.
territory. So those editors obviously were made aware of the numbers.
Mm.
As far as we were concerned, not necessarily an issue. You do find out about it occasionally. And I feel that what mattered most was breaking the right stories, giving the writers enough to read, and kind of expanding the line of reporting as well. But I feel that the interview, we often consider an interview to be question answer, like a
Yes.
Q&A format, but there's much more to the interview than the Q&A format. And every story features an interview element.
Yes.
So that's why I was talking about balance before, because I also remember a story where it was kind of a David versus Goliath kind of situation
Mm.
where an individual was going against a huge company because he felt he was being usurped by them, and that, there was an issue there. And so we ran a story, and I ran a story that was kind of, balanced. And then, that story came out, and the person called me, the person who was going against the big company called me and told me on the phone, okay, so now we have to figure out our next step. And I said, what are you talking about? I said, there's nothing to figure out. We're just a
Mm.
newspaper, and we have editorial license to decide what we're going to run and what
Yes.
we're not going to run. And we ran this story. Now, what we will continue reporting on is the further developments, but
Yes.
we are not going to be those further developments.
Yes.
So whenever you kind of hand out a mic to someone, it kind of creates an expectation.
Oh, absolutely. And
Hmm.
it's interesting, like this, I mean, we've talked about this, but I think when you're talking about, interviews can be sort of question, answer. And it can be the most unassuming interviews that you watch, that you realise how clever they are. And there's a show in Australia called, I think it's called Take Five with Zan Rowe. So it's a bit like Desert Island Discs. So Zan Rowe, a music journalist here, interviews someone for a half-hour episode about their top 5 songs, or sort of the songs that have shaped their life. And she did an episode with Noel Gallagher, and had been forbidden to talk about Liam Gallagher, obviously, his brother that he's largely estranged from. And she absolutely didn't broach the subject, but her interviewing style is very conversational. And by asking, what their 5 songs are and why they've chosen these 5 songs, the conversation flows. And in fact, there were many articles that talked about how comfortable Zan Rowe had made Noel Gallagher, that he actually brought. So she'd been forbidden to talk about Liam by Noel's manager. But in the end, Noel brought Liam up several times in the interview, because, Zan didn't go in hard. I mean, that's not the kind of journalist she is anyway. But it just showed this skill. And you watch these shows and you think they're, quite sweet, unassuming little conversations about music. But the skill she has she gives her interviewees space.
Hmm.
And I think it just highlighted what a good interviewer she was, that she created this environment that, in fact, Noel started talking about Liam throughout the interview. She didn't jump on it when he did start talking about, and sort of go, oh, okay, I've got the green light, I'm going to grill him some more about this. So I think it's an excellent exercise in how to really interview with skill and empathy, and give your interviewee space.
Hmm.
And that you get more out of them if you make them feel comfortable. Now, I mean, she's not a hard-hitting journalist so I'm not saying she's on 60 Minutes, but if you give your interviewee space and you make them feel comfortable, you can get far more out of them than if you're grilling them.
Absolutely, because they'll get defensive right away. And if
Well,
they get defensive, it will get very difficult to get any kind of information from them after that.
correct. So I want to then touch on one of my favourite interviews of all time from 1981 on Australian 60 Minutes. And this one, I think, I mean, it's a classic for anyone. Look it up on YouTube. It just highlights, actually, the interviewee's response. So it's George Negus, who a journalist in Australia, 60 Minutes, very well known, highly regarded, your real what would I say, sort of not old school, but has come up the ranks in journalism, born and bred journalism. That sort of old guard of journalists, he'd always wear his sort of, I think, like corduroy jacket, very 80s. And he interviewed Margaret Thatcher, who was Prime Minister at the time. And I'll just read verbatim parts of the interview. So George Negus says to Margaret Thatcher, as I said, who was Prime Minister of the UK at the time, "Why do people stop us in the street almost and tell us that Margaret Thatcher isn't just inflexible, she's not just single-minded. On occasion, she's plain pig-headed and won't be told by anyone." And I was looking up, and this whole article is actually about the art of negotiation and interviewing with this. And this article was saying that, Thatcher could have responded and said, "I'm not pig-headed, now let me prove it." But what she did, this is how she responded. So he has said, basically, everyone's telling us you're pig-headed. Her response was, in very Margaret Thatcher-like voice, "Would you tell me who has stopped you in the street and said that? Tell me who and where and when." And George Negus answers by saying, "Well, ordinary Britons in the restaurant in cabs." And then she goes on to sort of probe him further, and then she sort of concludes that the tone of his voice is changing. And this article said a not too subtle suggestion that he was wavering in his justification. And you watch it, and I admire her because basically he has made a sweeping statement. Everyone says you're pig-headed, and she goes down. Who are they? Where did they say this? When?
Mm-hmm.
And where do you go from that? Because he can't give names and locations and things. And I just love that as an example of, and look, I have no doubt Margaret Thatcher was pig-headed, but it just is a classic response to these big, grand, sweeping statements that these journalists can often make.
Well, likewise, I have a problem with, whenever I interview someone or I've interviewed someone in the past, when their answer starts with, "Everybody knows that," or, "Everybody knows that this and that, everybody knows that." And so I have an issue with that because, there are common truths that you have who is everybody?
Yes.
Who is everybody and what is your justification and what backup information do you have to be able to say that everybody knows that? So that's the kind of things that kind of set me off as a journalist that I always try to confront and go, you just said everybody knows. What allows you to say that and how can you back it up with tangible information?
Well, that's a good segue into my other highlight of an interview, once again on 60 Minutes. And I know you shared this clip with me recently, but I've find this whole clip fascinating, and there's been lots of articles written about it after and the journalist point of view. But it's 2005, Australian 60 Minutes. The journalist is Peter Overton and the interviewee is Tom Cruise. 2005, 4 years after Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman have split up, and for some context, Peter Overton grew up next door to Nicole Kidman. So, of course, would have known Tom Cruise in a social setting prior to this interview. So Peter Overton starts down the line of inquiry. Was Nicole the love of your life? I think it might have been a Mission Impossible. I can't remember what movie it was that Tom Cruise was playing. Peter Overton says, was Nicole the love of your life? Now, this is 4 years after they've split. And then he says to Tom Cruise, and credit to Tom Cruise because he handles those first questions really well. Then Peter Overton says, would you want Nicole to remarry? And Tom Cruise says, yes, I want Nicole to be happy. Then Peter Overton continues, do you have a relationship with Nicole where you talk professionally about each other's relationships? Now, as the viewer, you're like, what is this? I'm finding sitting really uncomfortable with this. Tom Cruise responds, here's the thing, Peter, you're stepping over the line, you know you are. And Peter Overton responds, I suppose they're questions that people want to know, the people. And Tom Cruise responds, you want to know. Take responsibility for what you want to know. Don't say it's what other people want to know. put your manners back in. And then Peter Overton says, do you think I was out of line? Tom Cruise says, yes. And Peter Overton says, well, I apologise profusely. And, I mean, there's so many layers to this interview because you know that, you know, I mean, you've got someone who is close friends with the ex-wife of this person that you're interviewing, and I'm sure there's all layers of dynamics and feelings and, you know, sides going on. These two would have known each other in a social setting prior to this interview. So Peter Overton probably feels he has a level of intimacy. But the way Tom Cruise says, no, people don't want to know this, you want to know this, and puts it right on him.
I understand that because it's interesting as an exercise to interview someone that you know. It's interesting because I have an issue with, I mean, both you and I have seen hundreds of
you had an issue.
No.
So you had an issue
Sorry,
with
I didn't finish my sentence because I was going into a question for you, which is we've both seen hundreds of press conferences, haven't we? So we kind of know how they work. One of the specificities of conferences in France is that the French language has two different words to say you. One is tu, which is familiar if you know the person, and one is vous if it's respectful and you don't know the person. I have sat and supervised many media conferences with mostly coaches of sports teams, where you have some of the journalists addressing them as tu. Well, most journalists would address them as vous. I knew some people that I have interviewed in the past, and I still, in a professional setup, would address them as vous because it was not the place to be familiar.
Yes.
But in those media conferences, it almost feels like some of the media want to send the message to everyone else that they're tight with the coaches and that they have a relationship with them and that they're closer to them than the other media. I mean, I'm saying it almost seems. It's blatantly obvious.
Well, I mean, as you're talking, I think we can talk about our good friend Oprah Winfrey, who loves, I mean, I think it's an interview with Vanessa Williams where she says something about all the bath salts that you gave me for Christmas last year. You know, she has to get, there's definitely journalists and presenters and interviewers that have to just slip in.
That they're friends.
Jimmy Kimmel does it. He, you know, talking with Jennifer Aniston or David Bateman about, when we went on holidays to, you know,
Ellen.
Ellen.
Ellen used to do it when she had a show. So yeah, she used to do it a lot. But can I say also that just to go back to that point is that you have to separate the journalist that you are from the person that you are and the person that you have in front of you. Although I do understand how interesting that moment, I mean, it's a pop culture moment that has gone down as a pop culture moment, that interview with Tom Cruise.
Yes.
So understandably, the journalist must have done something right for that particular interview to go to posterity. So
correct, but I don't know if it, I mean, I like Peter Overton, you know, and it just was so out of character for Peter Overton, I think, because he's a highly respected journalist here. You just felt like, oh, Peter, we don't need you sort of doing the dirty work for Nicole, which I'm sure I don't know Nicole Kidman, but I just don't feel she would have put him up to that because and what struck me even more so with that interview, knowing that Peter Overton and Peter Overton's sister is still very good friends with Nicole Kidman, is that Nicole Kidman and Tom Cruise are so intensely private.
Yes.
They don't air. So it just seemed so out of character.
And I find issue with that's something people want to know, as if the journalist had been tasked with a mission to gather that kind of information. What I find difficult as well in our line of work, and certainly you must have heard someone tell you, I'm just doing my job. You know, being a journalist at an event or in some specific contexts also means abiding by a certain number of rules. If you're at an event and you're accredited, your accreditation comes with its own set of rules. So it's not free for all and you can go in and do whatever you want because you're a journalist. There's some areas that you can't go to. There's some areas that only you can go to. Correct. So, you know, it's a game of some things are specifically designed for you to be able to do your job and some areas are off limits. But the number of times that I've had to tell people, you can't be here.
Yes.
Oh, but I'm just doing my job. No. Let me reiterate what you must have signed as a form. and
Yes.
said, yes, I will abide by these rules.
Oh, I've absolutely seen journalists have their accreditation removed at
Mm-hmm.
large international events because they're not abiding by the protocols. There.
Yeah, and I also have an issue. There are two sentences that just really drive me crazy at events. One is, I'm just doing my job. And the second one is, do you know who I am?
Mhm.
So there's been a bit of that as well in terms of, well, yes, I know who you are, but you're one of 15,000 journalists accredited for this event, and you
Yes,
kind of have to go by the same kind of rules that we've got for everyone else.
exactly. And I think there's the journalists that, uh, are doing their job, but there's the journalists who want to make a name for themselves as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just trying to find. Oh, yeah, there. And I think of Christiane Amanpour, the British
Christian
Iranian.
Amanpour on CNN.
Yes, I mean, to me, she I just adore her style,
Mm-hmm.
um, but I don't feel she ever makes it about her. I think she's not trying to. I don't know. Maybe she's been on the cover of Vogue and in Hello magazine, but I don't feel that's what she's going
Yeah.
for.
Mm-hmm.
There is that level of integrity there. Whereas, I mean, I did lose a lot of respect for Anderson Cooper when he did that Prince Harry interview and didn't challenge him on things that were clearly factually incorrect
Mm-hmm.
about these claims. But you were talking about Ellen before, and I know we've talked about sort of bullying in journalism and that level of being very familiar with your guests. And I think Ellen really played on that and portrayed this sense of, I'm friends with all these people, and so I can have these jokes with them. And, we've talked about Dakota Johnson pushing back on her. But I think, I think there is a level of we find out things years after the fact because either Ellen's no longer on air or people now feel comfortable to talk about it. And one of the ones that I think just highlights Ellen's tactics to the detriment of her guests, even though she presented herself as, it was a very light-hearted, feel-good show, was her treatment of Mariah Carey, trying to get Mariah to say she was pregnant.
Yes.
I'll just read an excerpt from an article here about it so Mariah talked about it after, but Mariah Carey has said that she found it extremely uncomfortable when Ellen DeGeneres asked her about her pregnancy in a 2008 interview. Mariah was asked to drink champagne to refute the rumours. She later suffered a miscarriage. And Mariah said, I was extremely uncomfortable with that moment, is all I can say, and I really have had a hard time grappling with the aftermath. Mariah told Vulture during a profile interview. In the video, Ellen is seen asking the singer about the rumours, but Mariah appeared hesitant to talk about it. And Mariah says, I wasn't ready to talk to anyone. And because she wouldn't say yes or no if she was pregnant, Ellen made her drink champagne to prove that she was or wasn't. And then to find out that Mariah had miscarried after all of this, it's like that is just how we all got sucked in. I mean, I don't think we did because we all started to see the light with Ellen. But to see that this was light entertainment, when you're putting a woman in that position, like how this actually wasn't called out earlier.
I couldn't agree more because we're touching on a very sensitive subject. And it's like you're being, I mean, what a violation of your private space, physical integrity, personal emotions. There aren't enough words to
No.
describe the number, the number in the many, many ways that interview was so wrong.
Yes.
And I feel that it kind of became Ellen's style
Yes.
to kind of hijack
Yeah.
the interview and almost like a hostage situation of, I'm not letting you get away with this. I won't take no for an answer. I remember an interview on Watch What Happens Live where they have the segment that Andy Cohen does with the guests, which is Plead the Fifth. So
Yes.
they're asked three questions and they can plead the fifth to only one, which means that they have to answer to the other two. And if they plead the fifth to the first one, they don't know what the other two questions are.
Yes.
And then I remember this interview with Christina Applegate, who I think is an amazing woman. Christina Applegate is being interviewed and she's being asked a question and she pleads the fifth. And then she's being asked another question, and then the crowd goes, ooh, because she doesn't want to answer. It was about her dating Brad Pitt and ditching him mid-event at an MTV event, a night that they were spending out. That's irrelevant. But Christina stopped for a second and looks at Andy and goes, I don't have to tell you anything. Like, if I don't want to answer your question, like just her realizing in that moment that she doesn't owe the truth to anyone and that she's not going to be forced to say anything. But I mean, good on her. And then Andy was like, he was game. He was like, no, no, you don't. So if you don't want to answer.
Such a good point, because in that setting with the lights on, you're in this segment, plead the fifth.
Right.
You do answer those questions. I mean, it's like James Corden used to have that game, where you'd either eat a terrible...
Spill your guts?
Yeah, or, you'd have to respond to something. But you're right, no one's making you answer the question. You're not going to be in contempt of court if you don't respond.
No, absolutely not. So I think that, I was also thinking about, so there's that of trying to get some kind of information one way or the other. And then there was interviewers schooling interviewees and kind of teaching them valuable life lessons. And one of my examples that I want to bring up is Oprah Winfrey's shaming of Toni Braxton back in the day, when Toni Braxton had filed for bankruptcy and she was going through personal issues. And she was on an interview with Oprah Winfrey that has gone down as infamous. And Oprah was kind of schooling Toni Braxton about her lavish lifestyle when she didn't have the money. And I think she said something, what's been reported is that she said something along the lines of, I hear you have Gucci flatware. I'm Oprah Winfrey and I don't have Gucci flatware. So, singling out a purchase or singling out a habit that someone might have to kind of shame them on television. And I think there was this very nasty movement at one point of, we have to get people on one of our interviews to let them tell their side of the story because there was a story out there. And people would do anything in their power to actually get these stars and get the scoop and have their first interview but it wasn't the people telling them their side of the story. It was the interviewers trying to get the dirt on a situation before everyone else.
Oh, absolutely. And there was an era, there still is an era of these presenters having a very godlike view of themselves. And Oprah Winfrey's one, the way she interviewed people, but they positioned themselves as sort of the moral yardstick as well.
Yes.
So the one I want to lead on to from that is Diane Sawyer. And Diane Sawyer's interview with Britney Spears when Britney Spears was 21. 21. And you've got Diane Sawyer, who's not a tabloid, journalist or presenter. She's highly esteemed. And, the lens now on that interview is not very flattering to Diane at all, but the way, and I think it was in Britney Spears' house this interview took place when Britney was, it was in 2003, I think. But the way she grilled Britney about her treatment of Justin Timberlake and her lifestyle, and once again, this girl was 21, but you've got this sort of moral compass of Diane Sawyer feeling this superiority to people like Britney Spears. And we've seen it I talked about it previously with Hoda, the way she interviewed Taylor Swift about, her treatment of ex-boyfriends in songs and things. And I think there's one thing when it's a Piers Morgan, you kind of know what you're going to get with a Piers Morgan, or you know what you're going to get when you go on a Fox News. It doesn't make it right, but I think you do know what you're going to get. But when you've got people like Oprah and Diane Sawyer that position themselves at this level of integrity and sort of untouchable and this superiority, and then the way they then slide in
Or
and
Gail King now.
yes, and attack, and this is what they're doing. They're attacking it, but they're disguising it as,
Yes.
good lines of questioning for journalism.
I remember the Oprah interview with Jennifer Aniston. That was probably the first interview after Jennifer Aniston separated from Brad Pitt. And it felt painful as a viewer that Oprah was interviewing Jennifer Aniston, who was putting on a smile and a brave face and, ready to take on the next chapter of her life, when it was clear that there was so much she hadn't dealt with.
Yes.
And Oprah posing it as, them having become friends and bonded because they did a girlfriend's weekend together with Jennifer's friends. And I mean, don't disguise it as a friends thing. Just say you want the dirt and you want to sit down with someone and get the first interview with them.
Yes.
So, and
because
I also,
in essence, you would look at this, the Oprah Winfrey would be the soft interview, would be the easy interview.
yes.
Jennifer Aniston on sort of, Fox News or Nightline or something. So it's kind of seen as the easy interview. But in fact, you're right. I mean, I remember that interview and it was just excruciating.
Absolutely. But I feel there's been a movement since Ellen went off the air and Oprah went off the air. The daytime shows that have taken over, I mean, they're not the most groundbreaking interviews. Let's be honest.
No.
It's a very shallow level of information digging.
Yes.
But if you think about Sherry Shepherd and Kelly Clarkson and Jennifer Hudson and Tamron Hall, all those talk shows have a feel-good aspect to them that kind of keeps them away from taking those, from doing those hard-hitting interviews that can come across as even unbearable for the viewer because, you can see that they're going for the dirt.
Exactly. And I get, I mean, we could talk about that and Drew Barrymore constantly.
Yes, Drew, of course. Oh my God. How could I forget about our friend Drew?
Our friend Drew, and completely invading personal space. Oh my gosh. Someone who needs personal space, I can't even watch Drew Barrymore interviews. But just going back to like the Jennifer Aniston one, I mean, I look at that from what responsibility did her management, her PR team, the studio, whoever she was, because there would have been a whole strategy on which outlets do we send, do we put it to them? And we talked about the Dixie Chicks, the Chicks, as they're now known, when they were out on the Taking the Long Road sort of tour. What did I say? Taking the Long Road. I'm taking the long road at the moment. But, she wouldn't have gone on Oprah by chance. There would have been a whole process around who we're going to send you to. And I just wonder, does Jennifer Aniston come off the stage and go, why the hell did you put me in that circumstance? But you're right, I'm sure Oprah would have wooed the hell out of Jennifer Aniston's team to get her on there. And we only need to have a look at Oprah at Harry and Meghan's wedding. There was a long process of those two being wooed to do the exclusive sit-down tell-all with Oprah Winfrey. Interestingly, though, she didn't grill them in the way that she has grilled other people or made them feel bad. So it's interesting, isn't it? Because then I look at, from a PR point of view, what responsibility did those people have? And there was a situation in Australia recently on Sky News. So, you could almost align Fox News and Sky News together. And a young teen had won a fishing competition in the Northern Territory. I think he won $1 million. Like, really feel-good story. And young Indigenous, and it's important I say Indigenous because I think we can all make the leap of judgment around Sky News. Anyway, so this teen wins. I think he caught a fish that had been tagged, and if you caught that tagged fish, you won $1 million. So, like, amazing. And
well done them.
Sorry?
Well done them.
Well done them. And in the press conference, They say to him, what are you going to do with the money? And he says, I'm going to pay off my parents' mortgages and help them out. Just a really feel-good story. So he goes on Sky News. Now, I don't know the story. I don't know if the fishing competition got him on Sky News or whether Sky News approached him directly. So I'm not going to talk on behalf of the event organisers because I think they would be, if it was me, I'd be absolutely mortified. The questioning he gets from Peter Stefanovic is he brings up a charge he's had in his youth of stealing like a quad bike. What relevant? And you just see the kid's face. And credit to the kid. He said, yes, I did. I've apologised. I regretted it. It was a mistake in my youth. So he owns it. The backlash has been immense, and Peter Stefanovic was, taken off air for a week or so and apologised. A pathetic apology. And the boy had stolen the car or is it a Polar? I think it's a quad bike. Anyway, from his boss at the time. His boss then came out and said, this kid was an amazing kid. He apologised at the time. It was a mistake. I've never held it against him. It should never have been brought up. So all the backlash that's come out. But I remember watching it, feeling for this boy who's just had the most amazing moment of his life and then on national television has been absolutely humiliated about something from his past. It had no relevance to them asking him about winning this fishing competition.
Yeah.
But then my PR and event hat came on and I thought, oh my gosh, I wonder if the event organisers, got him this interview, because you'd want to get coverage for this interview. Now, I work in the charity space. We don't pursue Sky News really for any stories because this is what can happen. And I just remember thinking, oh gosh, these well-meaning people have probably put this boy in this situation thinking it's going to be a feel-good story because the whole reason he was on there was the fishing competition. And then it takes this ugly, ugly turn.
Mm-hmm.
And I just remember thinking, oh gosh, that duty of care and that responsibility of the team that put him in that position. If a team did, I don't know, Sky may have contacted him individually, and so him. But it just made me think, oh gosh. So I always do feel for people when they're in a situation, thinking, wow, no one goes into a situation except maybe Prince Andrew, thinking that they're going to be grilled in an interview like that. You've got someone else coming into the gym.
Yes, I do. Charlene.
Do we need to wrap up?
No, we don't. It's fine.
Would they like to be a guest on the...
No, I don't think they would.
They're going to go... they're going to be telling stories for the rest of the week.
It's fine. They can. It was like a group of 7 people. I think they're just staying here and they just wanted to see the gym. So
I wanted to know what the action was.
I asked for permission to be here.
You did. And I can't stop looking at the big blow-up smiley face on the wall behind you, which I can't quite work out. Is it like a raft or something?
Yes, it's inflatable.
It's inflatable, yeah. Okay.
They just hung it on the wall.
Is there a pool at the gym?
No, it's just for fun.
Oh, okay.
For something funny to look at while you're on the treadmill. But I do have a story about that. And the duty of care can be, so many different things. But I was on your side for once at an event once, and we were looking at, I was facilitating media opportunities, but then at the same time, there were athletes being interviewed. And working for a sporting event, you have a responsibility for the media, but not at the expense of the athletes, of course. So it so happened that one of the journalists that I was chaperoning was interviewing all these athletes, and then at some point in the interview was breaking into general knowledge questions about the event and the countries participating and everything. And I thought to myself, don't put people on the spot like that. Everyone's general knowledge is different, and you don't necessarily know the capitals to every single country in the world, and you don't necessarily know how many medals this or that country has won at previous editions of the same event.
Yes.
And I was like, don't put people in an uncomfortable situation where, some people feel less than when they're being asked some of those questions. And it felt to me like it was almost like a violation of the, implicit understanding of when you go into an interview, you're not supposed to ambush the people that you're interviewing by asking them those kinds of questions,
Mhm.
which often happens on red carpets
Yes.
because that's another kind of interview that we haven't really spoken about yet. But that
Mm.
happens a lot on red carpets when people just stick a microphone in your face and ask you
Exactly.
all kinds of random
Yes.
questions because their line of reporting is this or that. But do the people that are being interviewed have to put up with the twisted, lines of reporting of all these organizations is what I'm asking.
Exactly. And while you were talking about that, I just was just searching one in my phone, so I got his name right. Martin Brundle, in Formula One, who's a former driver, who's now
Yeah,
an interviewer, and he interviews on the grid, while everyone's walking around pre-race. And he really gets in people's faces. And, I think he's become a bit of a cult figure because of his grid walk and the sort of the style of it. And the story then becomes which celebrity or sports star will talk to him or won't talk to him, and then the whole
right.
story becomes about there was one Martin Brundle grid walk brutality goes viral ahead of Monaco Grand Prix because the security guard of someone pushed him away.
Yeah,
So, his whole style, and he's not really in their face, but he is a bit bothering, I think, when you watch it. But,
yep,
it's become a spectacle. And I guess
yes.
if you have the privilege to be walking on the grid just before those, while everyone's getting ready and it's, chaos before the race, and Martin Brundle's going to be out there because he's been doing this for long enough at every Grand Prix. You do have to be prepared for it. But if you answer, that'll be a story like we talked about last week. If you don't answer it, it becomes a story.
Yes.
Mm.
Absolutely. And I feel that one of the examples that came to my mind as you were saying this is how Kelly Rowland gets asked about Beyonce every single interview that she does. And I
Yes.
remember her distinctly calling out. I mean, she's shown nothing but love for Beyonce. And we know this,
Yes.
that they're really close and tight and all that. But there were interviews where I saw her kind of redirect the line of reporting of the interview towards the topic that you wanted to discuss.
Yes.
And so that happens a lot as well. How many people get asked about Taylor Swift? How many people get asked about
Mm.
Beyonce? How many
Mm.
people get asked about the topic of the moment, which they
Yes.
don't necessarily have an opinion on? And
No.
I did mention Celine Dion last time, kind of very kindly but firmly
Yes.
asking the interviewer to stick to the movie that she was promoting on the red carpet that she was
Yes.
on. But some people just kind of a question is thrown at them and they just answer.
Absolutely. And it's just reminded me of a book. I can't think of the book's name. It's just terrible. But it's a very famous book where the author interviewed, 100 leaders in their field. And the first few chapters are around how he shaped the questions to ask
Yes.
them and the order that he shapes them in. And I'll give you the book title in the next episode in about last time. But it's
Hmm.
really interesting because he talks about the question of what's your favourite book. And he says he never asks people, what's your favourite book? Because he said these leaders will know, it'll pop up in a news article, it'll pop up on their Wikipedia profile. So they're it's very curated, the answer that they give. It's the answer it's not their favourite book. It's the book they want to be seen as their favourite book. So he said instead of asking what's your favourite book, he asks them, what book do you like to give as a gift?
Hmm.
Because he said then you get a bit more truth in the answer because otherwise the question is so guarded. So I found that really interesting in how people ask and shape questions and,
Hmm.
and reposition it, knowing that if they phrase it in one way, they'll get a very PR answer. If they phrase it in another way, they'll get a more honest answer. But
And
just
that's
going on, oh, sorry.
Now I was going to ask you, what book do you like to give as a gift?
I don't give books as gifts.
Well, just because, so I had dinner today with friends I went to their wedding, and they asked as a gift from every guest, they asked for every guest to give them a book to
Mm.
put a
Oh, yes.
kind of a library together
Yes.
in their house. And I gave them Down Under by Bill Bryson. And I
Oh.
should have mentioned that in the Australia episode, in last week's episode.
But
And
we could mention Bill Bryson in any episode about any country,
yeah,
and
but
he
it was, I mean,
was
with your mention of that question, I just had to go there. And I gave them
that's
that book
gold.
as kind of like an indicator of my love for Australia, but it's
Yes,
such a funny book about Australia
yes.
as well.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, just wanted to plug that for a sec.
Thank you.
But
Yeah,
you
very
raised a
good.
good point.
Very good.
Sequence is very important. Sequence is very
Absolutely.
important. And one thing that we used to learn in journalism school, and I have put together media conferences, fake media conferences with actual guests, and then
Yes.
with the students having to go then and write an article about it, just as I had to do when I was a student at
Yes.
UTS. So I put those together, and we were told and we were taught that you should always respect the flow of a conference. Otherwise, you're killing it for everyone else.
Mm.
Because if someone stands up and asks the hard-hitting question,
Yes.
or a question that is completely off the book or something, it's going to throw the guest off, and it's going to create an
Yes.
atmosphere in the press conference that's going to kill it for everyone else.
Absolutely. Yes. You don't want to
So
put offside the subject of the interview because
So,
you're not going to have
so
anything.
you raise a very good point about how important, even in an interview, the sequence of the questions,
Mm. Yes.
it's so important to think them
Yes.
through. So that person who wrote a book that you'll tell us the title of next time.
I'll go and look
Yes.
in my office. It's a big book. I know that. It's a
Mhm,
big, thick book, and it's black and yellow on the cover.
mhm,
But just talking, we're talking about sport and press conferences, and I alluded to this in the last episode, but about the tennis journalism friend who talked about which players actually make you want to be a better journalist and
mhm.
keep you on your toes and make you accountable for your questions. But he definitely was saying it in a not admiration, but as a positive that these players, made you want to be better at your questioning. And it just, I think a player who is very good at making journalists need to be very good with their questions is Andy Murray.
Mhm.
And Andy Murray calls out casual sexism in so many senses. He's called it out in the focus that was on his female coach, Emily Maresmo, and why that was such a big deal that a former, female player was coaching a male player. Why, when we have so many male coaches of female players, that there's one particular press conference in 2009 that Murray was doing. So the post-match press conference was talking about, and the journalist is asking Murray about Sam Querrey, who knocked out the defending Wimbledon champion in the quarterfinal, and was the first US male tennis player to reach a Grand Slam final in 8 years. So Sam beat American. And the journalist says, Andy, Sam is the first American player to reach the semi-final of a slam since 2009. And you just hear Andy Murray say, male player. And
Mhm.
the journalist says, I beg your pardon. And Murray repeats, male player, right? And the journalist says, oh, yes, first male player, that's for sure. And he laughs it off. I don't think the journalist has any idea that Andy Murray has just completely called him out for sexism. Hello, Serena Williams, one of the
Right.
greatest of all time, just completely gets discarded in this conversation.
Yeah.
And he did it again when he was asked about winning medals at the Olympics, and he brings up that the Williams sisters have actually achieved the feat. So what's fascinating about that is just how quick Murray was to just say male player, and the way he just corrects the journalist. But even more so, the way I still don't think the journalist really gets what he did and what a fool he looked like, because he laughs, oh, yes, of course, male player. It dismisses the whole legacy of Serena Williams in that line of questioning. But I think, and Murray is often talked about of how much he does call out that casual sexism and how much he will put it back on journos if their line of questioning is incorrect.
Yes, absolutely. And I think we've seen many, and I mean, there's so many videos now popping up about these instances where interviewers get called out during, mostly press conferences. And
Mm.
there's, I think that it's good that we're in an age where those instances can, be readily available for people to
Yes.
revisit, because it used to be, the talk of the town for 5 minutes and then people would forget about it. But those kind of elements have stayed with us and they pop up on our algorithms occasionally. And I think it's a good reminder that there are some people out there who still
Yes.
confront the media when they're being asked these silly questions.
Absolutely. And the other one, which I alluded to, which I've got the sort of transcript here, is after his win at the 2016 Rio Olympics, Murray found himself, and I'm reading from a Sydney Morning Herald article here, Murray found himself again reminding a journalist that he and the Williams sisters played the same sport, which I just love that line. When BBC commentator, now this is the BBC, pull your socks up, BBC. BBC commentator John Inverdale congratulated Murray on being the first person to ever win 2 gold medals in tennis. And Murray replied, I think Venus and Serena have won about 4 each. Yeah, I mean, and the way Murray delivers it is, he's so just deadpan. He doesn't he doesn't get angry. He just puts them back in their place. No, I shouldn't say puts them back. He corrects them. And not only is he correcting them, he is honouring the legacy of female tennis players, and not letting them be forgotten. So, anyway, there's my not my honourable mention, my gold medal to Andy Murray.
I have
and
one.
And a highly commended to Margaret Thatcher.
I do have one that I want to bring up because that's been popping up quite a bit as well recently, is an interview of Greek basketball player. Sorry, I'm going to try not butcher the name, but it's Giannis. Oh, geez. Giannis Antetokounmpo.
Mm-hmm.
So he was asked about, so he played for Milwaukee in the United States, and he was asked about the failure component of the season, if he, as a player, considered their season to have been a failure.
Mm-hmm.
And he just put his head in his hands and went, "You asked me the same question last year. Do you get a promotion at work every year?" And the journalist had to answer. And I think he repeated the question. He's like, "Do you get a promotion at work every year?" And the journalist said, "No." He said, "Do you consider every year that you've worked that you didn't get a promotion a failure?" And then he goes on to say, "There's no failure in sports. It's not a failure. It's steps to success." And then he goes on and says, "There's good days, bad days. Some days you're able to be successful. Some days you're not." And that's what sports is about. I mean, kudos to those people who not only confront the media that way,
Yes.
but who confront it in such a meaningful, impactful way that actually transcends the stupidity of the question and
absolutely.
becomes a motto for people, whatever your field of accomplishment or your professional field is.
Yes. Oh, I love that interview, and it does the rounds so much on social media. Because he's just so spot on, and you can feel and I mean, I guess it's hard. Like, these journos have to go in press conference after press conference, week after week, trying to think of new questions to get a different answer to someone else, and so I acknowledge that, but don't be lazy with your questions, and be prepared. Be prepared if you're going to ask a question. Be prepared for the answer.
And I think it's also, people tend to not know that these conferences also have a moderator. Most often there's someone moderating the meeting. So very often we only see the question and answer portion, and that's edited. But there's also a moderator who if you watch some sports conferences that are available on YouTube that are broadcast live and then stay online, you'll see that there's a moderator. And it's hard for a moderator to know every single media representative from every country. So sometimes you're just going to allow a question from a person. I've been in conversations over text messages from my duty as a press conference manager to the moderator, identifying some of the media in the room and telling the moderator what their lines of reporting were, so that they could make an informed decision in distributing the questions.
Yes.
So I think there's a lot of that as well.
Exactly. But, once again, if a moderator shuts down a question or doesn't go to a journo who keeps saying, why aren't you letting me ask this question? That becomes a story. So,
And absolutely.
but my producers are telling me we've got 5 minutes left.
Yes.
So,
I just wanted to say very quickly three things.
yes.
First of all, I feel that the format of the interview will forever be, because it is a very unedited, organic way of doing things. And I have to give a shout out to Interview Magazine, which I still think is a groundbreaking magazine in its kind of in the way it's embraced the interview format and only the interview format. I also want to give a shout out to the roundtable format, because it's
yes.
one that I really love. And I feel that when you have the right moderator, and I particularly like Lacey Rose from The Hollywood Reporter, she does really good roundtables where she just throws the question and lets the conversation happen. And we're talking high profile actors, actresses, producers, directors here. So I find that the roundtable is interesting in that it allows people to answer to the same question together, and it becomes a conversation. And lastly, I want to go back very quickly to Ellen DeGeneres, because Ellen DeGeneres came out during one of her stand-up performances a few weeks ago, and you shared the article with me, and put on the same level the fact that she was fired from her sitcom because she had come out as gay, and the fact that she had been fired from her talk show because she was dancing or whatever it is that she felt that she was doing on that show. I just want to say that it is absolutely outrageous, however much she has done for LGBTQ plus rights, to believe that she has the right to put those two things on the same level.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Because her own little situation as a talk show host and her show coming to an end because some things came up that, if they are verified, are absolutely appalling. Putting that on the same level as her show being canned for just her having said that she is gay is just the most
it's
appalling case of moral kind of relativism, and putting those two things on the same level.
It's like when bad behavior is excused as mental health issues, and it absolutely disrespects the people with genuine mental health challenges. Because you have mental health challenges doesn't mean you do bad behavior. But that's right. The go-to for a lot of celebrities when they, go away, have some brain farts and appalling behavior, or they make appalling comments or whatever it is.
And I'm surprised I'm surprised that it wasn't a bigger story that Ellen ended up putting those two things on the same level and feeling that she could.
Yes. But I also think it showed that no one cares about Ellen anymore. I mean, that was a bit article on news.com here, and then it didn't go anywhere else. So, well, thank you. I mean, I feel we've learned a lot, so that when we have Tina Arena on, we'll be good with our interviewing style.
Well, you're putting $1 in the jar this week because I hadn't mentioned her yet. But I guess being a Melburnian, you can not put the dollar in the jar.
That's right. Okay, 2 minutes. 2 minutes left. So, quick pop culture moment of the week.
Okay, so for me, the pop culture moment of the week is I am a huge fan of the Mamas and the Papas.
Yes.
So
you've got a minute.
Yes. No, it's going to go fast. So Mama Cass's daughter has written a book about her mom.
Yep.
So I feel that was long overdue. And what is interesting is that Mama Cass's daughter was very young when her mom died. And so she never really lived with her. So it's a very documented book that she wrote through interviews and conversations. But because it's her daughter, you kind of feel that she has moral license to actually come up with a book that if someone else had written, you wouldn't have really considered it to be as impactful. So I feel that Mama Cass was a fascinating character in pop culture in the 70s, the Mamas and the Papas, and then her own career. So I am reading the book currently, and I feel it's a very interesting read when you go into it from a place of this is a daughter kind of discovering her mom through the
Yes.
book.
Yes.
So I recommend that read to anyone who's interested.
Very good. Thank you. My pop culture moment of the week is Adele at her residency in Las Vegas, where mid-show someone yelled out, "Pride sucks." And understandably, Adele responds with, "Are you effing serious? What are you effing even doing at this show?" And
Yes.
obviously Adele has a big LGBTQI following. Doesn't matter, even if you don't, you push back on that kind of homophobia. And of course, those videos have gone viral. But what has transpired is the person didn't say pride sucks. They said work sucks. So Adele had actually been talking about how tired she was because she'd been working so much. The person yelled out, "Work sucks." And everyone around this person has validated this and verified that they didn't say pride sucks. They said work sucks.
I hadn't heard about that latest development.
She has misheard it as pride sucks, has launched into, I'm not going to say tirade because that sounds like it wasn't justified. I think if someone yells out pride sucks,
it was short.
Her response is absolutely justified. But then to hear that they didn't actually say pride sucks. And I did think it was funny because there seemed to be no context for this person to suddenly yell out pride sucks. But no, she'd been talking about how tired she was because how much she'd been working. This person yells out work sucks.
Oh my God, that's crazy.
It all gets misheard. So there we go.
Well, thank you, because I didn't know about that latest development. So
bringing you breaking news.
Yeah, well, look, we're all for breaking news, and we all love a story gone kind of sideways.
Of course, but I mean, what will last is the vision of her having a go back at this person. The crucial information of the fact that she misheard it won't. I mean, you hadn't heard that. It's not been picked up that much. The story that makes more interest is that. But on that note, I must bid you farewell.
Well, thank you, and I apologize for the many, many interruptions during the episode. Yeah, I mean, I was not expecting the person coming in to get their bike or the group coming in to visit the gym.
Exactly, but it all adds, you know. I think next time we need to interview any guest stars. So
yes, to join in.
On that note, have a good week, and until next time.
Thank you. See you soon.
Bye. Oh, hang on. You're still here.
I am still here. I'm still in Clermont-Ferrand, France, and I'm Vicken Karkukli.
I'm still in Melbourne because I can't work out how to end this recording, and I'm Georgie Stations. This has been Drop It Like It's Pop.
Be sure to follow us on our Instagram page at Drop Like It's Pop to have access to our latest episodes and playlists.
Until next time.